All right, so welcome back. We're still talking about World War II Homefront. So in the last one, we looked at primarily the economic side and how the U.S. actually gets itself involved, how it pays for the war, and how we get the citizens to kind of help out and donate through propaganda and also the use of war bonds and how we promote that. So this is kind of the second part, talking about the social steps the U.S. took to produce enough to win, as well as the economic impact and the impact of the role of women and other disenfranchised groups in the U.S. All right, so in terms of soldiers, we saw the United States started to prepare for World War II prior to the war actually beginning. So you can kind of see the total number of people in the military prior to the actual start of the war. So 1939, when World War II is actually declared, when we see Hitler invading Poland and France and Great Britain getting involved, we're at a third of a million men. That is not a whole lot of people. You notice that the Air Force isn't listed here because the Air Force was at this point divided between the Army and the Navy. It wasn't its own thing yet. So by 1941, and mind you, Pearl Harbor obviously has a bit of a shock value in here because it, right afterwards in the remaining 3 or so weeks in December 1941, obviously numbers rise up, but not all of these people signed up right in December. We started drafting people prior to the war actually beginning, or before our actual declaration in 1941. Hence why you see a slow buildup of all this stuff. All right, so that means that we got to get, again, like we said in World War I, we have to bring in the rest of the United States because of that. So when we're talking about women in the war, okay, 6 million jobs open up for women because we see a number of obviously young men going off to serve in the military or in military-related things. So we see that women obviously help to fill in those gaps, and 2.5 million of those jobs for women are in war-related industries. So typically in things that are made specifically for manufacturing goods, supplies, munitions, weapons, all for the military or things related to it. All right. At the same time, obviously, we still see that women are obviously not paid equally for doing the same job as a man because obviously men are considered, again, the stronger gender, the stronger sex. So that inequality obviously persists, but you get the idea of Rosie the Riveter here showing that women, in fact, can do the same job as a man and can contribute just as much. All right. On top of that, we get 350,000 women. 350,000 women serving in the armed forces as soldiers, pilots, secretaries, nurses, truck drivers, mechanics. Again, more behind the scenes stuff than actual on the front lines. So if they are pilots, they are cargo planes. They are delivering supplies to the front. All right, if they are soldiers, they're primarily, secretary soldiers. They are nurses, not exactly doctors. They're driving the trucks. They're doing the mechanical jobs. So essential things that are needed in the military, but unfortunately not on the front line. So not contributing in that sense, but helping the machine run and function, which is just actually pretty important as well. But again, not on the front lines, right? So supply and reserve roles is kind of their whole point. So again, there's a lot of propaganda for the women. So the WWIIs, women accepted for volunteer emergency services, obviously acting as pilots. So the Pistol Pacific Mama, with the name of this little aircraft carrier here, or this transport plane. All right. Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. So they have the ability to become sergeants, lieutenants, kind of move their way up and contribute into the service. All right. But again, showing, here we have women making, at this point, here are shells for the artillery. But again, if you're looking at, the work that they're doing, putting this stuff together, if you looked at the Donald Duck cartoon, this is essentially what Donald Duck is building, these weapons for war. And again, who are the women, what are the women doing? Essentially making it. Who's the supervisor is primarily a man. All right. So women are contributing, but still obviously in that secondary role. All right, here we see more African-American women helping putting together what could be parts for a plane, could be parts for a tank, a ship, but it's still, again, in that manufacturing position. So we get to see some more of that integration, not only of the gender, but also of races here as well. All right, so for African Americans, we have what's called the Double V campaign. All right, what that stands for is fighting for democracy and the end of racism both abroad and at home. So the world that we're fighting is to end the threat of Hitler and the threat of Mussolini, of Japanese imperialism, make the world safe for democracy, but also to bring that back home. So at the end of it, this is where we're going to start to see a very big shift towards we're going to fight for equality. If we're going to fight to, end it with the Nazis, then we're going to have to fight it here in the United States as well, because it's a contradiction. That's something we're going to pick up with in the next unit when we get to the Cold War, and then following that, the Civil Rights Movement. All right, so African Americans in the military, We still unfortunately see segregation of soldiers, much as we saw obviously in the Civil War with the movie Glory, and it continued in World War I and all the wars in between all of this, right? So early in the war, primarily fitting into the non-combat roles and could not fight. So in many cases, they are supply services, much as they are with women. So cooks, transportation, the Red Ball Express. There's a reading on Schoology to look at for that, which is really interesting. In the essential role that the supply side of stuff is actually just as important as the actual soldiers, because how are you going to get the supplies to the troops? You have to have a continuum momentum there. And that's something we're going to talk about when we get to the course of the war in the next lesson. All right, so African Americans are eventually given that opportunity to engage in combat, both as pilots and as soldiers on the ground. Now, unfortunately, there's obviously a very big discrepancy in terms of the jobs and the duties that they're given. In many cases, they're thought of as not being as competent as white soldiers, but also they weren't trained to the level that white soldiers were because of the views of what they were capable of, which was quite unfortunate, which meant that in early combat situations, they didn't perform as well as white soldiers because of, again, levels of education being as unequal as they were in many cases, but also who they were up against at what times in fighting. But eventually, given that chance and that training and the experience, they actually helped contribute to a lot of victories, especially in Italy and also in the Western Front, fighting against the Nazis both in Italy and in France and Germany. All right. So, example with the Tuskegee Airmen being, if anyone's seen the movie Red Tails about 10 years back, or actually seen the movie Tuskegee Airmen, which is kind of what Red Tails is based on, where you saw these segregated units fighting very, very well once they were given the experience and the time to actually be successful. Now at home, for the other half of that WWII campaign, obviously we're wanting to end discrimination in the United States, so the seed by hiring practices in defense contractors. Because a lot of times we saw that African Americans were denied access to a lot of military-specific jobs or military support positions in those industries. So defense contractors were, in many cases, especially in the South, only hiring white people and refusing to hire African Americans. And so obviously we've seen some different stuff already when we looked at that, women in the war industry there. We saw African American women in there. So 1 million African Americans work in war-related industries, and again, much like in World War I, we see more African Americans moving north for work in factories and away from production. So moving towards these manufacturing hubs like Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, where we see a lot of that production going on. So photo of the Tuskegee Airmen here, obviously behind a fighter plane. All right, so one squadron there, African-American soldiers serving on Guadalcanal in the Pacific as a Marine. Again, our African-American women serving here inside of a war industry plant, working on a plane here, putting together shells. This is a little Dr. Seuss cartoon. Listen, Maestro, if you want to get real harmony, you got to use the black keys as well as the white. All right, so you can see that the black keys on the piano haven't been touched. We got some cobwebs there. And then Uncle Sam tells the war industry, you got to get in line because the piano makes beautiful music, and it's best music when everybody is together. All right, so even the propaganda was aimed at, together we win. All right, so united we win. African Americans and whites working together. So everybody better buck up and work together in this instant. Even if you don't necessarily believe in the social equality, we need to work together for the United States to actually win this thing. All right, so there's that article on the Red Ball Express. Take a look at it when you get a chance. So the idea is going to be exactly looking at the impact that the Red Ball Express had on the Allied war effort and the experiences that they went through. All right. So then we also want to look at how were Hispanics and Japanese Americans treated during the war. So in one example, we're talking about the Bracero program. All right, so this primarily focuses on Latinx people. So with men off to war, people moving to the cities, who is going to plant the crops? So one thing that the United States did at this point, and this is kind of an ironic twist here, seeing as how for those that had me during trimester 2, when we talked about the Mexican repatriation, where we literally forced hundreds of thousands of Mexican people and American citizens who had Hispanic ancestry literally back to Mexico during the Depression, gave the blaming of the others. We see that the U.S., and this is a program that actually starts in World War II and actually lasts current day in some sense, that the U.S. allows 200,000 Mexicans to work part of the year inside the southwestern states, so Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, for agriculture. So for 3, 4, 5, 6 months, work in the United States, grow crops here, and then they move back to Mexico for the other part of the year. This is also where we see, issues at the border today, where we talk about people that literally work in Mexico, live in Mexico but work in the United States, because again, need for agricultural workers is huge in this part of the country. All right. So here we have just the idea again, braceros contracted to the United States. All right, so it's not a high number. It's about 50,000 or so during the war, and actually it grows during the actual 50s. And then, we see, unfortunately, a fallback of that, but it's still a couple thousand a year that work at least part-time in the United States for several months, legally. All right, now, that doesn't mean that discrimination ended. All right, one example here is the zoot suit riot. So here we have a zoot suit, kind of the way that Hispanics were considered to have dressed back in the day. Kind of obviously the pants tucked in well above the waist, suspenders, stuff like that. This is more of a comical look than anything else. These more examples of zoot suits are kind of more realistic stuff is down here in the bottom right. But unfortunately, we did see that there was still a lot of racial tension between these groups. All right, Mexican Americans living in L.A., there was a belief that they beat up a white sailor. It turns out that that was actually kind of a falsehood. Led to a 4-day riot against Mexican Americans because of wearing zoot suits. That was kind of the way that they were able to signify who were Hispanics, and so that ended up leading to a couple hundred of them being arrested. And so only Mexican Americans were arrested, and the city banned the wearing of the zoot suit throughout the entirety of the war because they believed it caused more racial tension. The sailors that got involved, the Army soldiers that got involved, the Marines that got involved, none of them were openly prosecuted, so nothing really bad happened to them, right, unfortunately. So kind of that double standard on racism. So if we were in class, we'd go a little more in depth with this going to camp idea here, but we're not. So we're just going to kind of dive into this part. So essentially, when we talk about the treatment of Japanese Americans, this is kind of where we see a lot of the really bad parts of racism come out. So President Roosevelt orders Executive Order 9066. So this allowed the government to remove all Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants from states that bordered the Pacific Ocean. So remember that, we'd pretty much already cut off Chinese immigration. So we had Asian Americans obviously still living on the West Coast, but most of them were coming from Japan, the Philippines, and places like that. And there was a lot of resentment prior to the war, but now the war gave an excuse to remove them for fear of spying. All right? So the idea was that they were going to spy and sabotage the effort, so they pretty much came to your door, said you and your family have to leave. You had like 2 days to do it, and then we're sending you to an isolated internment camp somewhere on the internal part of the United States. And so most had to sell their stuff really quickly because you could only bring whatever you could carry, and which was not a whole lot. And so unfortunately, this caused a lot of problems during the war and after the war because of the issues, obviously, that it brings up. Because no German American or Italian American was, treated in any manner that the Japanese were. All right, when there were in fact proven German spies that actually did sabotage some stuff on the East Coast, none of this ever happened on the West Coast. No Japanese American was ever, or immigrant, ever accused or found to be of, doing stuff against the United States. So kind of a look at the internment camps here. Again, kind of more in that desert area with some of them, like in Arizona and New Mexico, barbed wire keeping them in. All right, but they would try to make the best of it and try and force kind of the ideas of America on them by, here's the Pledge of Allegiance, making them kind of do Boy Scout-ish things. But again, very bare. Not a whole lot of bed cots in there, forcing families to live pretty close together. But again, there's the V for victory sign, teaching them to win the war. So kind of forcing patriotism on them. But there were still schools and things like that. So kind of the internment camps, again, more on the internal parts of the United States that happened. But again, this leads to a lot of mistreatment. All right. So Dr. Seuss, who, as we've looked at a number of these cartoons, here's kind of one of the worst ones, talking about the idea of a fifth column where the Japanese are going to strike us from within with the Japanese people who aren't loyal to the United States. They're actually loyal to Japan, that they're going to get us from within, waiting for the signal from home, meaning Japan, which was a very unfair view from Mr. Seuss. All right, now, it's not that the Japanese didn't even try to challenge it. They did. And in Korematsu v. United States, the Supreme Court said it was legal to put the Japanese Americans into these camps because we're at war. It's national safety. So kind of like restricting the freedoms that we lost in World War I on the basis of, it's a threat to the country. So it was found to be legal. Now, the unfortunate part was what happened afterward